There is a voice that has narrated more than 50 years of American cinema. A sound so deep and unhurried that the moment it reaches you, something in your chest goes still. It has made legends of ordinary cowboys. It has turned whispered farewells into poetry, and it almost never existed. For nearly 2 decades, Sam Elliott was the man Hollywood kept almost choosing. The face they recognized but could not place. The name that left audition rooms empty-handed while safer bets took the roles that should have been his. He did not arrive young and golden. He was built slowly, the way canyons are, by pressure, erosion, and an almost unreasonable refusal to disappear. But here is what the legend rarely tells you. Behind the mustache, behind the drawl, and behind one of the most recognizable voices in the history of film, there is a man shaped by a wound that never fully closed. A father who died before witnessing a single triumph. A love story so quietly extraordinary that Hollywood, with all its manufactured romance, could not have written it better. And a controversy at 74 years old that threatened to erase everything he had spent a lifetime building. How does a man spend 20 years in Hollywood's wilderness and still refuse to leave? What does it cost to become iconic on your own terms, and no one else's? And what happens when the world finally stops long enough to look at what was standing there all along? Before we answer any of that, we need to go back to where it started. To a father, a silence, and the wound that built him. Some men are shaped by what they are given. Sam Elliott was shaped by what was withheld. He was born on August 9, 1944, in Sacramento, California, a city of straight lines and flat ambition, far removed from the rugged landscapes that would one day define his image. His father, Henry Nelson Elliott, was a man of government, a worker for the California Department of Fish and Game. Practical and purposeful, built from the same no-nonsense fabric as the post-war American male. His mother, Glynn Mamie Suter, was warmer, quieter. A woman who held the household together with the kind of steady love that rarely announces itself. On the surface, it was a respectable, ordinary upbringing. But ordinary households carry extraordinary silences. And in the Elliott home, and the silence that mattered most, lived between a father and a son who wanted desperately to be seen, and a man who simply did not know how to look. Henry Elliott was not cruel. He was not absent in the physical sense. He showed up for meals, for discipline, for the structure that defined his generation's idea of fatherhood. But warmth was not part of his vocabulary. Approval was a currency he rarely spent. And for a boy already restless, already drawn to something his world could not quite name, that emotional distance carved a wound that would take decades to understand. When Sam was 13, the family relocated to Portland, Oregon, a move that uprooted whatever fragile roots the boy had begun to plant. Portland in the late 1950s was a city of rain and reservation. And for a teenager navigating the volatile terrain of adolescence, the displacement only deepened a growing sense of not quite belonging. He was tall, awkward, in the way only lanky teenagers can be, with features too strong for a boy, and not yet understood as remarkable for a man. He found no particular glory in school. No trophies, no titles, no moments of recognition that the world tends to attach to eventual legends. What he found instead were the hills, the trails, the wide Oregon wilderness where the noise of expectation fell away, and something quieter took its place. Nature did not demand that he be more than he was. And in that silence, something in Sam Elliott began to settle into itself. But it was at the University of Oregon, where the first real confrontation arrived. Not with the world, but with his father. Sam had discovered something. A calling, though he would not have named it so boldly then. He wanted to act, not as a hobby, not as a fallback, but as the thing his life was meant to orbit. He had felt it watching westerns as a boy, had sensed it in the way certain performances seemed to reach through the screen and grip something real inside him. Acting was not an escape from life. For Sam, it was the first honest map of it. Henry Elliott did not see it that way. The conversation between them was not recorded, not dramatized for any documentary, not softened by the distance of time. But its shape is known. A father who believed in tangible work, in measurable contribution, in a life built from reliable foundation, and a son who was telling him that he intended to pursue something as uncertain and, to Henry's mind, as frivolous as performing. The disapproval was not explosive. It was worse than that. It was steady, a quiet, immovable conviction that his son was making a mistake. Sam transferred to Clark College in Vancouver, Washington, a smaller school, a quieter decision. He worked odd jobs, a land surveyor, a brief attempt at the kind of practical life his father would have recognized. But the pull did not release him. Could not. Some callings are not chosen so much as they are discovered already written into you. And Sam Elliott, no matter how many times he deferred to practicality, could not unfind what he had found. In the mid-1960s, he made the decision that would define every year that followed. He moved to Los Angeles. He arrived not with connections or confidence, but with the particular stubbornness of a man who has already talked himself out of his dream once and refuses to do it again. Hollywood in that era was not gentle to newcomers, particularly newcomers who did not fit the mold of what the industry thought it wanted. And Sam Elliott was not the mold. He was too quiet for comic roles, too intense for light drama, too unconventional in an era that rewarded a very specific kind of leading man. He picked up work where he could. Bit parts, background roles, commercials that paid the rent and tested the patience. A Chevron commercial gave him his first real screen moment. Brief and forgettable to everyone, except the man who needed to believe the next step was possible. He waited tables, he parked cars, he showed up to auditions that led to other auditions that led to nothing. In the years in that wilderness were not romantic. They were exhausting in the particular way that hope sustained on very little evidence becomes exhausting. Every actor who survives that period carries a specific scar. The knowledge of how close they came to quitting, of the exact moment they almost let the city win. For Sam, those years were measured not in triumphs, but in survival. Small television appearances in the late 1960s. A role here, a scene there, enough to keep him from disappearing entirely. Not enough to make anyone remember his name by morning. And then, in 1970, the phone that rang too late. His father, Henry Elliott, died. Gone before a single role worth speaking of had materialized. Gone before the mustache became iconic, before the drawl became legendary, and before the world learned to stop and listen when Sam Elliott entered a room. The man whose approval Sam had chased across years of rejection and across the width of a continent never lived to see what his son became. It is the cruelest arithmetic of certain lives, that the people we most need to witness our becoming leave before the story reveals itself. Sam Elliott has spoken of his father rarely, and always with the careful tone of a man measuring how much truth to release. But the weight of that absence is visible in everything he has said about legacy, about validation, about what it means to keep going when no one is watching. He kept going. Not because it was easy, Not because the industry gave him any reason to believe it would reward him, but because some men are built in such a way that stopping is simply not available to them. And the wound his father left did not break him. It made him quieter, more certain, more immovable. The boy from Portland who could not earn his father's approval was still standing in Hollywood, still waiting, still refusing to become anything other than exactly what he was. And the world, slowly, was about to run out of reasons to ignore him. There is a particular kind of suffering that Hollywood does not advertise. It does not arrive with dramatic rejection letters or public humiliation. It comes quietly, in the form of almost cast, almost remembered, almost enough. For Sam Elliott, the 1970s were a decade defined by that word, almost. He had survived the 1960s on stubbornness and small roles, on the kind of peripheral presence that keeps a man technically in the game without ever letting him feel like a player. But as the new decade opened, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way the industry tends to celebrate, but enough to suggest that the long patience might eventually mean something. In 1969, he had appeared in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, one of the most celebrated films of its era. His role was small enough to be invisible to most audiences. A card player, a background figure in a scene that belonged entirely to Newman and Redford. But he was there, in the same frame as legends, watching, absorbing, storing something he could not yet use. It was the kind of credit that looks impressive on paper and means very little in the room where decisions are made. Hollywood has always been a city where proximity to greatness is not the same as being granted access to it. Sam Elliott knew this better than most. He had been close enough to the fire to feel its warmth. He was still not allowed to sit beside it. Television became his territory in those years. Guest appearances accumulated like evidence in a case with no clear verdict. Lancer, Gunsmoke, Mission Impossible, and the FBI, the great procedural landscape of American primetime, where character actors lived between obscurity and recognition, never quite crossing into either. He showed up, delivered, disappeared. Week after week, season after season. The face appeared on screen and vanished before anyone thought to write the name down. What made this period particularly brutal was not the scarcity of work. It was the scarcity of weight. Sam Elliott was always capable. Directors who worked with him knew it. Casting agents who passed on him knew it. The problem was not talent. It was category. The industry did not yet have a proper shelf for what he was. He was too authentically masculine for an era that was experimenting with a different kind of screen hero. The conflicted, ironic, self-aware male that the new Hollywood movement had elevated. T. Elliott was not conflicted in the way the decade preferred. He was not searching for himself on screen. He had already found himself. And an industry in love with existential uncertainty did not quite know what to do with a man who simply was. He was also, by this point, unmistakably himself in ways that should have been advantages, but registered as complications. The mustache, which would one day become one of the most recognizable physical signatures in American cinema, was already present. Thick, deliberate, anchoring a face that seemed sculpted for landscapes rather than living rooms. The voice had deepened into something that did not belong to any particular decade. It was timeless in a medium obsessed with the contemporary. And so he waited, not passively. Sam Elliott has never been a passive man, but with the active patience of someone who understands that certain things cannot be forced. He took the roles that came. He prepared for them with the same seriousness he would bring to the roles that would eventually matter. He did not allow the size of the opportunity to determine the size of his commitment. In 1976, Lifeguard arrived, a modest film, largely forgotten by history, but significant in ways the box office never captured. It gave Sam Elliott his first leading role, a man named Rick Carlson, a lifeguard approaching middle age and confronting the quiet panic of a life that has not become what was once imagined. The character was, in ways that required no great stretch of imagination, adjacent to Sam's own reality. A man still waiting for something to arrive. He's still refusing to abandon a post he was not sure would ever be relieved. The film did not make him a star, but it proved something to the people watching closely. That this man could carry a film. That the presence, which had registered in small doses across a decade of television, was not a trick of lighting or brief charisma. It was real, and it was sustainable, and it was waiting for the right vessel. But the right vessel did not arrive immediately. The late 1970s continued in much the same rhythm. Television work, supporting roles, the particular indignity of being someone other actors recognized and admired, while the industry at large continued to treat him as a supporting player in his own career. What sustained him in these years was not industry validation. The industry was barely offering any. See, what sustained him was something more private, more durable, and more significant than any role Hollywood might have provided. It was a woman named Katherine Ross. They had first met on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969. She as Etta Place, already an established star following The Graduate. He as an uncredited background figure trying not to disappear entirely. The meeting was brief, circumstantial, the kind that gets filed away under the category of people encountered and left behind as the world keeps moving. But the world, occasionally, circles back. They crossed paths again in 1978 on the set of The Legacy, a British horror film that history has not been particularly kind to. But what happened between them on that set is the kind of story that resists the language of Hollywood romance precisely because it was not a Hollywood romance. It was quieter than that, more uncertain, more real. Katherine Ross was, by any measure, the bigger name. She had earned an Academy Award nomination at 30. She had appeared in some of the defining films of her generation. She had a career that Sam Elliott, still fighting for recognition, could only observe from a respectful distance. And yet, what developed between them was not defined by those distances. It was defined by something neither the industry nor its hierarchies had any authority over. They did not rush. They did not perform. They existed in each other's orbit for years before making it permanent. A patience that mirrored, in its own way, the patience Sam had always applied to everything else that mattered to him. They married in 1984, quietly, without spectacle, in a ceremony that reflected exactly who they were. Two people who had chosen each other with the same deliberateness that the best decisions always carry. But before that marriage became the anchor of his life, Sam Elliott had one more chapter of the wilderness to survive. One more door that needed to open wide enough for the world to finally see what had been standing behind it all along. That door had a name, and when it opened, nothing that came after would ever be the same. There are love stories built for the screen, and then there are love stories that make the screen look insufficient. What Sam Elliott and Katherine Ross built together does not belong to the vocabulary of Hollywood romance, the kind manufactured in press tours and dissolved in divorce filings before the premiere dust settles. What they built was something rarer, quieter, and far more difficult to sustain in an industry specifically designed to corrode the things that matter most. By the time they married in May 1984, both had already lived enough to know the difference between what glitters and what endures. Katherine Ross had navigated the particular exhaustion of being a celebrated woman in a system that celebrates women only until it finds a reason not to. Sam Elliott had spent nearly 2 decades learning that the industry's approval was never going to arrive on schedule, and that a man who waits for external validation to feel worthy will wait forever. They chose each other instead, deliberately, without fanfare, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after enough time has passed to separate what you want from what you actually need. Their daughter, Cleo Rose Elliott, was born in 1984, the same year as their marriage, a convergence that collapsed the distance between becoming a husband and becoming a father into a single transformative season. Sam Elliott, the man who had spent 20 years in the wilderness of Hollywood's indifference, suddenly had 2 reasons that made every year of waiting feel not wasted, but necessary, and as if the delay had been arranged specifically to deliver him here, to this particular life, at this precise moment of readiness. He has spoken of Katherine with a consistency that is itself a kind of testimony. Not in the overproduced language of celebrity interviews, but in the plain, unhurried way of a man describing something he considers simply true. "She's the love of my life," he has said, more than once, without elaboration, as if the sentence requires nothing added to it. And in an industry where love stories are routinely revised, performed, and eventually retracted, that plainness is its own extraordinary statement. Katherine, for her part, has described their marriage with the same quiet certainty. 2 people who recognized something in each other that the rest of the world was not yet looking for, who built a life in Malibu and away from the machinery of celebrity, close enough to the industry to work and far enough from it to remain whole. But love, however real, does not pay for the life that surrounds it. And Sam Elliott still needed Hollywood to catch up with what he had always been. It began to, slowly, and then all at once, in the way that breakthroughs tend to arrive after long silences. In 1988, Mask of Zorro passed him by. Tombstone still lay years ahead. But 1988 delivered something that recalibrated everything. A television miniseries called The Quick and the Dead, and more significantly, supporting turns in increasingly visible projects had begun stacking his credits with weight rather than just volume. But it was Roadhouse in 1989 that planted his flag in the cultural consciousness in a way nothing before it had managed. Roadhouse was not a critic's film. It was never intended to be. It was loud, unapologetic, and precisely calibrated to deliver exactly what it promised. A film that knew what it was and committed to that knowledge without apology. Sam Elliott played Wade Garrett, the mentor, the older hand, the man whose presence anchors the chaos around him with the particular authority of someone who has already survived everything the plot is still worrying about. It was not a leading role, but it was the role that made audiences sit up and ask the question they should have been asking for 20 years. Who is that? The answer, delivered through a slow drawl and an unhurried gaze, was Sam Elliott. And suddenly, the name that had been present without registering became one that lodged itself in the memory and refused to leave. The same year, he appeared in Prancer, a quieter film, gentler in its ambitions, but further evidence of a range that the industry had spent 2 decades failing to properly catalog. He could anchor action. He could hold stillness. He could fill silence with presence in a way that most actors spend entire careers attempting, and few ever achieve. Then came 1993, and the film that many consider the defining chapter of his legacy, Tombstone. As Virgil Earp, Sam Elliott did not need to dominate the screen. The film had Kurt Russell. It had Val Kilmer delivering what many still consider the performance of his career as Doc Holliday. Since what Tombstone required from Sam Elliott was something more difficult than dominance. It required grounding. The kind of steady, unmovable authenticity that makes every scene around it feel more real simply by proximity. He provided it without effort, or rather, with the kind of effort that has been practiced so long it no longer resembles effort at all. Virgil Earp was a man of duty and quiet grief, of loyalty that cost more than he ever acknowledged aloud. In other words, he was exactly the kind of man Sam Elliott had spent a lifetime understanding from the inside. The film was a cultural phenomenon, and though the headlines attached to it belonged largely to Kilmer's incandescent Holiday, the people who studied the film closely, who watched it more than once, who returned to it across years, knew that what held it together, and what gave it its spine, was partially the man with the mustache who never raised his voice and never needed to. By the mid-1990s, the career had been irrevocably transformed, not by a single explosion of fame, but by an accumulation of presence. Film after film, performance after performance, that had built something more durable than stardom. It had built a reputation, the kind that does not depend on a single role or a single moment, but rests on the collective weight of 20 years of uncompromising work. He had become, without quite announcing it, the man Hollywood called when it needed a scene to feel true, when it needed the audience to believe, without question, that the person on screen had actually lived the life being depicted rather than merely performing it. That is a specific and irreplaceable gift. And the industry, having spent 2 decades overlooking it, had finally stopped being able to afford to. At home in Malibu, the life he and Katherine had built continued its quiet architecture. Cleo was growing. The house held the rhythms of a family that had chosen privacy as deliberately as Sam had chosen persistence. The awards and the recognition that were beginning to accumulate were welcomed. But they did not rearrange the furniture of what actually mattered. He had spent 20 years in the wilderness waiting for the world to find him. What he discovered in the finding was that the wilderness had not been wasted time. It had been the education. Every year of almost, every near miss and overlooked credit, every audition that ended in silence. All of it had been preparation for the roles that now fit him so precisely because he had become, through all of it, exactly and irrevocably himself. The world had finally caught up, and Sam Elliott, unhurried as ever, was simply standing where he had always been. Fame, when it finally arrives after decades of waiting, does not come gently. It comes with everything attached: the light and the shadow, the celebration and the scrutiny, the sudden discovery that the world, having ignored you for years, now feels entitled to an opinion about everything you are. Sam Elliott learned this in the most public way possible. Not as a young man with the resilience of inexperience to cushion the blow, but at 74 years old, when a person has already decided who they are and has very little patience for being told otherwise. The catalyst was a film that arrived like a second lifetime. When Bradley Cooper cast Sam Elliott as Bobby Maine in A Star Is Born in 2018, something shifted in the cultural atmosphere around a man who had been a constant presence for 50 years without ever quite receiving the full weight of the industry's formal recognition. The film itself was a phenomenon. A love story wrapped in the tragedy of fame and decline, carried by Cooper's direction and Lady Gaga's extraordinary performance. But it was Sam Elliott, in a supporting role that required him to be simultaneously tender and wounded, protective and broken, who stopped conversations. As Bobby Maine, the older brother watching his siblings' destruction with the helplessness of someone who sees the ending clearly and cannot prevent it, Elliott delivered something that his earlier career had always promised and never quite been given the formal stage to demonstrate. He was devastating, quietly, precisely, unbearably devastating. In scene after scene, he communicated volumes in the space between words, in the set of his jaw, the weight of his silences, the particular grief of a man who loves imperfectly and knows it. The awards season that followed was the industry's long overdue reckoning with its own negligence. A Golden Globe nomination, a Screen Actors Guild Award nomination alongside the cast. The name Sam Elliott appeared on lists and in conversations that should have included it decades earlier. Critics who had spent years taking him for granted suddenly wrote about him as a discovery. A response that was simultaneously gratifying and faintly absurd to anyone who had been paying attention since Tombstone. He received the attention with the same unhurried dignity he had always carried. No manufactured gratitude, no performed humility, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had always known the work was there and had simply waited for enough people to finally look. But the attention that A Star is Born delivered was a door that swung in two directions, and what came through it next was not celebration. In February 2022, on Mark Maron's WTF podcast, Sam Elliott spoke about the power of the dog, Jane Campion's acclaimed Western that had dominated that year's awards conversation. What he said landed like a detonation. He called the film, bluntly and without diplomatic cushioning, a piece of work that failed to represent the West authentically, and made comments about its themes and its male characters that were widely interpreted as dismissive of its lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer content. The words were unfiltered. They were also, and in significant ways, indefensible. The response was immediate and merciless. In an industry that had spent years performing progressive values with varying degrees of sincerity, the comments from one of its most beloved figures became a flashpoint. Headlines that had recently celebrated him now dissected him. Social media, which has never had much patience for complexity, delivered its verdict with the speed and finality it reserves for public transgressions. Jane Campion, receiving her own awards that season, responded with measured precision. The confrontation between them, however brief and indirect, became the story that temporarily eclipsed everything else. What followed revealed something essential about Sam Elliott. He did not hide. He did not issue a statement crafted by publicists designed to minimize damage while admitting nothing. He apologized. Directly. To Campion specifically, and to those his words had wounded. The apology was not elegant. It did not erase what had been said. But it was real, which in a landscape of manufactured contrition is its own form of courage. He told an interviewer simply, "It was a dumb thing to say." No architecture of justification, no reframing, just accountability, delivered in the same plain language he has always used for things that matter. The controversy did not destroy him, but it marked him. And in marking him, it added another layer to a story that has always been more complicated than the image suggested. Because Sam Elliott, the icon, the mustache, and the voice that sounds like the American West given human form, is also a man of his generation, shaped by the particular limitations and blind spots that no amount of authenticity entirely dissolves. He has never claimed otherwise, has never presented himself as a man without contradictions, and perhaps that is why the public, after the initial eruption, did not abandon him. Because there is something in his consistent refusal to perform a version of himself that is easier to consume that earns, over time, a particular kind of trust. The trust that comes from knowing that what you see is actually what is there. Beneath the public turbulence, the private costs of a life lived at the pace Sam Elliott has lived, it were also accumulating in quieter registers. Decades of physical roles, the westerns, the action films, the demanding shoots across rugged locations, had left their marks on a body that was never designed to be decorative, but had always been asked to be functional. He has spoken carefully about the adjustments that age requires, about the recalibration of what the body can and cannot be asked to absorb, the morning stiffness, the care required now for things that once required none, the particular humility of discovering that the instrument you have always relied upon has its own timeline, its own negotiations. His voice, remarkably, has deepened further still, as if age has only added resonance to something already extraordinary. But the man behind the voice has had to learn the same lessons that age teaches everyone who lives long enough to receive them. That endurance has a cost, that the body keeps an account. Eat that what you do not pay in youth, you settle later. At home in Malibu, with Katherine beside him and the Pacific visible from the windows of the life they built together, those costs are managed with the same practicality he has always applied to difficulty. Quietly, without theater, with the understanding that complaint changes nothing and presence changes everything. His daughter Cleo, now an adult carving her own path through a world shaped by a last name that carries significant weight, has navigated the particular challenges of being the child of someone the public believes it owns. Sam has watched that navigation with the careful restraint of a parent who understands that protection sometimes looks like stepping back, that the most loving thing a father can offer is not shelter from difficulty, but the example of how to endure it. And the price of being real, Sam Elliott has discovered across 7 decades, is that reality does not offer the protections that performance does. A performed version of himself might have avoided the 2022 controversy. A more calculated man might have measured his words against the cultural temperature before releasing them. But Sam Elliott has never been that man, has never known how to be. And in a world saturated with calculation, that stubbornness, that immovable commitment to being exactly what he is, consequences accepted, remains the most genuinely radical thing about him. The world wanted an icon. What it got was a human being. And in the end, that has always been the more enduring gift. There is a moment in every long life when the accumulation of years begins to reveal its meaning. Not in the trophies arranged on shelves or the credits listed in databases, but in the quality of the silence between one breath and the next, in the texture of an ordinary morning, in the specific weight of knowing, without needing anyone to confirm it, that the life you built was worth the building. Sam Elliott is in that moment now. At 80 years old, a number that sits strangely beside the image of a man whose presence has always carried the timelessness of landscape rather than the fragility of age, he exists in a register of life that few in his industry ever reach, with both their integrity and their humanity intact. The machinery of Hollywood has consumed cleaner men and kinder ones, and it has chewed through talent more obvious and charm more marketable. What it could never quite process, what it ultimately had to accommodate rather than reshape, was the particular stubbornness of a man who simply refused to become anything other than exactly what he was. That stubbornness, which the industry once cataloged as a limitation, is now understood as the source of everything. He still works, not from financial necessity. A career spanning 6 decades has built foundations that do not require him to take anything he does not choose, but from the same quiet compulsion that carried him through the wilderness years, through the decades of almost, through the long patience of a man who believed that the work itself was the point, even when no one was watching. When the role is right, when the material carries the weight he requires before committing his name and his presence to it, Sam Elliott shows up, fully, without reservation. With the same seriousness he brought to every uncredited moment in every forgettable production that kept the dream technically alive while the world looked elsewhere. In 2019, he joined the cast of 1883, the Yellowstone prequel that became one of the most watched television events of its era. As Shea Brennan, a man hollowed by loss, propelled by duty, navigating the brutal arithmetic of the American frontier with the resignation of someone who has made peace with a world that has taken everything from him. Sam Elliott delivered what many critics have quietly identified as the finest sustained performance of his career. Not a single scene of bravura, not a theatrical moment designed for clip reels, but something rarer and more demanding, a consistent, episode-by-episode inhabitation of a human being in full. Grief, purpose, weariness, and the particular dignity of a man who keeps moving, not because he believes in the destination, but because stopping is its own kind of surrender. The performance earned him an Emmy nomination. The industry, which had spent decades finding reasons to look past him, was now finding reasons to look directly at him and acknowledge what had always been there. It was gratifying, he allowed, in the understated way he allows most things. But the satisfaction was not in the nomination. It was in the work. It has always been in the work. At home in Malibu, the life he and Katherine have constructed across 4 decades of marriage continues its quiet, undeliberate rhythm. The house sits at a remove from the industry's center of gravity, close enough to remain connected, far enough to remain sane. Mornings begin without the urgency that once defined them. The Pacific, visible from where they have chosen to plant themselves, offers the kind of perspective that no career achievement has ever been able to manufacture. Katherine Ross, who turned 83 in 2023, remains beside him with the same steadiness that has defined their partnership since they chose each other on a film set in 1978 and spent the following 6 years deciding how seriously they meant it. Their marriage has now outlasted the careers of most of the people who once occupied the same industry zip codes, outlasted the relationships that were photographed more extensively and celebrated more loudly and dissolved more completely. What they have built together has the specific durability of things constructed slowly, with attention, without the pressure of an audience. He has described her, consistently, as the best decision he ever made. Not in the performed language of anniversary speeches, but in the plain declarative way of a man stating a fact he considers beyond argument. In an industry where love is frequently confused with publicity and partnership with strategic alignment, the plainness of that statement is its own kind of revolutionary act. Their daughter Cleo has carved a path of her own. A musician, an artist, a woman navigating the complex inheritance of a name that arrives with both gift and weight. Sam has watched her become herself, with the careful restraint of a father who understands that his role now is witness rather than architect. He has spoken of her with the particular tenderness that surfaces in him when he discusses the things he considers most sacred. Briefly, without performance, with the tone of a man who knows that some feelings are diminished rather than elevated by elaborate expression. The grandeur of what his career has accumulated, the credits, the nominations, the cultural footprint of a voice and a face and a presence that have become genuinely iconic, sits lightly on him. Or perhaps, more accurately, it sits in its proper proportion beside the things he has always considered more significant. He has never been confused about the hierarchy. The work matters. The people beside him matter more. And the morning matters. The ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being present for the life that surrounds the career. That has always mattered most. He walks the Malibu coastline with the unhurried pace of a man who has earned the right to move at his own speed. He reads. He is, by most accounts of those who know him, excellent company. Not in the performing sense, not with the practiced social warmth of someone managing a public image, but in the way of a man who listens more than he speaks and means what he says when he does speak. The voice, in person, carries the same quality it has always carried on screen. The sense that what is being communicated has been considered before delivery. That silence is not absence, but preparation. The mustache, which has achieved a kind of cultural independence, referenced, imitated, is celebrated as an artifact of a particular American masculinity that the culture both romanticizes and struggles to define, remains. Gray now, fuller perhaps, but present with the same deliberateness it has always projected. He has been asked about it more times than any human being should reasonably be asked about a physical feature. His answer, when he gives one, tends toward the simple. It is who he is. It has always been who he is. Removing it would not simplify the image. It would only complicate the man. What Sam Elliott represents in the culture, and he represents something, whether or not he has ever sought to, is increasingly clarified by contrast. In an era of carefully managed personas, of brands carefully constructed and relentlessly maintained, of authenticity as performance and vulnerability as strategy, he stands as evidence that another approach remains possible. That a person can move through an industry specifically designed to reshape them and arrive at the other end still recognizable to themselves. That success does not require the surrender of the thing that made the success worth having. He has never been easy to categorize. The industry spent decades trying and eventually gave up. He is not the classical Hollywood leading man. Too angular, too quiet, too genuinely interior for the demands that category places on its occupants. He is not the character actor in the limiting sense. Too iconic, too recognizable, too much his own thing to be subsumed into the work without remainder. He is something the industry does not have a proper shelf for, which is perhaps why his career has outlasted every trend that tried to define what was relevant and what was not. He has simply been Sam Elliott. Through the mailroom years and the wilderness years, through the almost and the finally, and the aftermath of finally, through the controversy and the recognition, and the long, ordinary days between the extraordinary ones. That consistency, stubborn, unwavering, occasionally costly, is both the simplest and most remarkable thing about him. There is a scene that those who know him well tend to describe in various forms when asked what Sam Elliott is actually like, away from the camera and the mythology. It is not a dramatic scene. It contains no particular wisdom spoken aloud, no moment of performed insight. It is simply him on the Malibu coast, moving at his own pace. And with the particular quality of presence that some people carry, the sense that they are actually here, actually in this moment, not elsewhere in their minds, or performing for an invisible audience. That quality, full presence, genuine attention, the radical simplicity of being where you are, is the thing that screen actors spend entire careers trying to manufacture, and that Sam Elliott has simply always been. It is why a camera loves him in the way that cameras love very few people. Not because he is beautiful, though he is that, in the specific way that faces shaped by time and experience and genuine living are beautiful, but because he is real. undeniably, unmistakably, in every register of the word, real. His father never lived to see it. Henry Elliott, the man whose approval Sam chased across decades of rejection and across the geography of a continent, died before the mustache became iconic, before the voice became legendary, before the world learned that this was a man worth stopping for. That wound has never fully closed. Sam has said as much, in the careful way he discusses the things that have marked him most deeply. The regret is not dramatic. It is steady. A presence in the background of the triumph. A reminder that the people we most need to witness our becoming do not always stay long enough to see the ending. But perhaps that father, the practical man who measured worth in tangible achievement and could not recognize his son's calling until it was too late to say so, perhaps he would recognize it now. In the 6 decades of uncompromising work, in the marriage that has outlasted everything the industry has thrown at it, in the daughter who carries his name into her own life with both the gift and the weight of it, in the performances that will exist in the permanent record of what cinema has been. Available to anyone who needs to be reminded that authenticity is not a style, but a discipline. Sam Elliott did not build an empire, he built a life, and he built it in such a way that the line between the two is barely visible. Because the work always reflected the man, and the man never stopped being worth the reflection. What remains, when the credits have accumulated and the awards have been received, and the controversies have settled into the permanent record, and the ordinary mornings have compounded into decades. What remains is this: a voice unlike any other. A face that time has made more itself rather than less. A marriage that has quietly disproven every cynical thing the industry believes about love. A daughter finding her own path. A coastline walked at the right pace. A career built not on what the world said it wanted, but on what one man knew, with the stubbornness of the deeply certain, that he had to give. And the understanding, arriving late, as the most important understandings tend to, that the long wait was not punishment. It was preparation. Every year in the wilderness, every role that went to someone else, every room he left empty-handed, all of it was building toward a man solid enough to carry what eventually arrived, toward a presence durable enough to still be standing when the world finally stopped moving long enough to look. He waited. He endured. He refused. He remained. And the world, running out of reasons to look away, looked. What it found was Sam Elliott, exactly as he had always been, exactly as he always will be. If his story has moved you, if something in this man's refusal to be anything other than himself has reminded you of something you once promised yourself and have not yet kept, share this video. Pass it forward. Not because Sam Elliott needs the attention. He has learned, across 8 decades, to exist without requiring it. But because the rest of us need the reminder. That patience is not weakness. That authenticity is not naivete. That the life built slowly, with intention, without the crowd's permission. That life is the one worth building. Subscribe for more stories of people who endured long enough to become exactly who they were always meant to be. And leave a comment below. Tell us, what does Sam Elliott's journey mean to you? What in this story spoke to the part of you still waiting, still refusing, still standing at your own particular crossroad? Because if his story teaches us anything, it is this: the wait is not the enemy, it is the making of you.